Swami Kriyananda did compose over 400 pieces of music, and we love to sing those. Today, as it happens, we have a center near Assisi in Italy, in the mountains there. And all three pieces that our friends Bhima and Bhakti will be singing were composed at that center years ago, two specifically for St. Francis. And so in the morning when we greet the sun, and Father, now that I wander with thee, Bhima and Bhakti, take it away.
The sun, when I move forth through crowded ways, in my heart, Lord, ever so silently, I will always think of thee.
friends, and welcome. My name is Nayaswamis Hriman, and my wife Nayaswami Padma. And East meets West, and the twain shall meet. This is part 2 of our series, our interfaith series, In the Way of Awakening. And I'd like to, you will be introduced soon to Dambara Begley and Peony Lee, who live and serve at the Ananda Farm on Kameno Island. Padma and I live and serve nearby here in Lynnwood and at the Blue Lotus Temple in Bothell. And so we shall begin with
music. We like to begin with music at Ananda with whatever we do. Swami Kriyananda, our founder, composed over 400 pieces of music. And this morning, this moment, Dambara and Peony are going to play for us 2 songs, the Beatitudes, which speaks for itself, and Life is a Dream, which also speaks for itself. So, please.
Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed who thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, they shall be called the children of God. Bless those reviled for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven.
Life is a dream, time like a stream. Excuse me. Wrong key, let's try this. Life is a dream, time like a stream, carries our burdens away.
Never despair, joys everywhere. Love can befriend you today. Free from all care, like birds on the air, soar above griefs and worries, seek joy and be gay.
Often on earth, things of great worth, worldly ambitions defy.
Sometimes a friend helps us ascend up from life's cares to the sky. Love is a star, though shining afar. It can guide us and help us toward light to draw nigh. Life is a dream, time like a stream, carries our burdens away. Never despair, joys everywhere. Love can befriend you today. Free from all care, like birds on the air, soar above griefs and worries, seek joy and be gay. Often on earth, things of great worth, worldly ambitions defy. Sometimes a friend helps us ascend up from life's cares to the sky. Love is a star, though shining afar. It can guide us and help us toward light to draw nigh. Love is a star, though shining afar. It can guide us and help us toward light to draw nigh.
Thank you. We'd like to start today with the subject of reincarnation, which admittedly is more a subject for the discussion or the topic of the way of belief rather than the way of awakening. After all, as a great saint once said, past lives of all are dark. What we do now is what's most important. So even though that is the case, the way of belief often leads to the way of awakening. Reincarnation is kind of a fulcrum point between East and West, if you will. I understand that as many as a quarter of Christians believe in reincarnation, and close to half the population in the world does. But then we used to believe the world was flat, so it's not really, our beliefs won't save us. But nonetheless, it's both a fascinating topic and it provides for our heart an understanding of the true mercy and justice of God. I grew up, as I may have mentioned last time, as a Catholic and trained for the priesthood at an early point in my life, and so I got dyed in the wool of things like dogma, and I just prefer to think that I outgrew it rather than rejected it, because truth is truth. Truth is one and eternal, and underlying all forms, including your form and mine and all things, lies the ultimate truth of what is now known and popularized in Sanskrit as Tattvamasi. Thou art that. Thou art the spirit, not the body. And it's interesting that in the promise of the scriptures and the great saints and sages over the history of humanity, that has been the good news, is we are more than we seem, more than we appear. It's interesting that in the resurrection of Jesus, two important facts took place historically in Judaism at the time, which have given a bit of a twist on the understanding of Christians about the life and teachings of Jesus. One of those is the resurrection of the body. The concept of a resurrected body was actually intertwined in Judaism before the life of Jesus. And given the age in which he came, an age that of not particularly great understanding of things, the teaching, the resurrection of the body simply endorsed and promised the resurrection of the ego, the physical form. But the real message of that resurrection was the transcendent soul has power over even death. And so it was that, for reasons quite understandable, the Jews of Jesus' time expected their Messiah, like Moses before and other prophets, to free them from bondage, from political occupation. And so that wasn't Jesus' message. So in both cases, the misunderstanding of the promise is quite understandable. As the ages went on, as Christianity established itself, questions began to arise. But in the early stages of Christianity, one of the first great thinkers of Christianity, Origen, in the early centuries, wrote that the teaching of reincarnation had been handed down since apostolic times. It was a continuum. And we know that between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, such topics like that were warp and woof with their debates and so forth. And so at some point came the question of the death of babies and young people who had not achieved the age of reason. And so up popped the concept of limbo. Similarly with purgatory, with only one life, the difference between heaven and hell, you might say, was eternal. So somehow they had to make amends for the people who weren't too bad, and up popped purgatory. Now, I'm being a little bit facetious. Both of them have a kind of reality on the higher planes of consciousness, but what I'm saying is that the teaching of one life caused a few twists and turns in people's understanding. What about animals, for example? Much of Christianity teaches that animals have no souls. Well, if you have a pet, or if you study the life of animals, even in the wild, you'll see the incredible human qualities of self-sacrifice, of loyalty, of love. And so reincarnation comes in to offer a continuum of consciousness, an evolution of consciousness that is far more gratifying to the heart. And what does one make of Jesus' statement? He gives a long, I forget which chapter, and a long list of do's and don'ts and this and that and this and that. And at the end, he concludes, "Be ye therefore perfect, as your Father in heaven, which is perfect." Well, in one life, you're going to have to grade on the curve to get into heaven, because being perfect is, well, difficult. And so that teaching, which, by the way, was only officially removed from Christian dogma in 533 at a convocation of bishops, of which the Pope himself boycotted the council. And of course, in more modern times, some of the great philosophers of the West, Voltaire, Robert Hume, Schopenhauer, and others, have believed in reincarnation. Okay, but did Jesus teach reincarnation? Well, it's a curious story. Twice in his own words in the Bible, he makes a reference, but stops short of either denying it or endorsing it. There was one point where John the Baptist's disciples came to meet Jesus, because John had told them to do that. And as they were walking away, Jesus, addressing the crowd of people around him, started to speak of the high spiritual stature of John the Baptist. And I'll read from Matthew. As John's disciples were leaving, Jesus began to speak to the crowd about John. And then he went on, "For all the prophets in the law prophesied until the coming of John. And if you are willing to accept it, he is the Elijah who is to come. Whoever has ears, let him hear." So in that statement, Jesus made an oblique reference to reincarnation. Later, also in Matthew, several chapters later, after the transfiguration of Jesus on Mount Tabor, they were coming down, he and the three disciples, and the disciples were pretty quiet. Actually, it was a pretty intense experience according to the Bible. And as they were coming down, Jesus instructed them, "Don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." Then the disciples asked him, "Why then do the teachers of the law say Elijah must come first?" Now, mind you, in the Transfiguration, it was Moses, Elijah, and Jesus whose astral shining bodies were seen in that event. And Jesus replied, "To be sure, Elijah comes and will restore all things, but I tell you, Elijah has already come. They did not recognize him, but have done to him everything they wished. In the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands." And then the Bible says, then the disciples understood that he was talking to them about John the Baptist. in the last words of the Old Testament, which I didn't print out, is a prophecy of the coming of Elijah, who centuries before that point in time had already come and gone, so to speak. And so this teaching of reincarnation is there. And then the last one I want to mention is an entire chapter in the Gospel of John that starts off, and as he, Jesus, went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Well, how could he have sinned if he was born blind, unless he had a prior life? Now, I admit Jesus once again sidestepped the issue rather cleverly. Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be revealed. So why then, given several opportunities to endorse or reject reincarnation, Jesus steps sideways? Well, in the understanding we have received from the ancient civilizations that speak of the rising and falling of the virtue and consciousness of humanity over long thousands of years, it is taught that at the time of Jesus, historically, humanity was at a rather low ebb of our consciousness. And I always remember our teacher, our friend and founder of Ananda, Swami Kriyananda, saying that after a lecture that he gave in which he mentioned reincarnation and so on, one of the people leaving the auditorium was heard to say, "Oh boy, we get to come back." And that's the point, isn't it? We have to come back until we get it right. But to a lesser form of understanding, such as existed in his age, the opportunity to keep coming back would not be an incentive to seek God. Hence entered fire and brimstone, if you will, because people more materialistic, attached and identified solely with the physical body and physical things and with their social status, which was relatively fixed during that age and through the Middle Ages, that promise of return meant nothing, whereas the promise of the resurrection of their body was a promise they could relate to. And so in the book of Revelation, in fact, this is repeated several times in Revelation, but this particular quote is the clearest of them. "Him that overcometh will I make a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go out no more." And so we find in this understanding of our comings and goings satisfaction for the heart and the mind as well, for the deformities, the suffering, the injustices, and things that we see in this world can really make very little sense if we see it as one life. I remember after 9/11, Larry King interviewed the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the founder of Transcendental Meditation. And I was a little dismayed, to be honest with you. Larry King was asking him what he thought of 9/11 and the death of over 2,000 people and so on. And Larry King, in a way that I know Yogananda or my friend and teacher Swami Kriyananda would never have done, cited what will be our next topic, the law of karma. When someone is grieving and suffering, do you say to them, "Well, it's your fault"? It's the law of karma. I mean, think of the book of Job, one of the greatest books of the Old Testament. That's what his friends said to him. "Job, you're suffering because you must have done something." But in fact, it was a test. God was testing at the behest, by the way, of Satan, if you remember your book of Job, to see if Job would retain his love for God, his faith in the goodness of God, even if he lost all the things on a material plane that he had been given. He was wealthy and so on and so forth. And he held true in faith to the end. But his friends, and nowadays our friends, they don't say sin, they say karma, you see? And so it isn't that simple. The law of reincarnation, the process of reincarnation, is an opportunity. It is a gift by which we can continue our journey on the way of awakening. People say, well, why don't I remember? Well, what do you remember anyway? How much of what you did yesterday do you remember? How much of your childhood do you remember? But the fact is there are hundreds, especially in this day of communication and documentation, hundreds of cases and books written about people who do in fact remember their past lives. And so it is a great gift. It's not intended for us to kick back and say, well, I'll deal with that later. That's not the idea. In fact, in the autobiography of a yogi, Yogananda has this sentence that goes something like this. He says, until the soul awakens to the anguishing monotony of repeated rounds of birth, life, and death, and rebirth, does it yearn for an escape clause? Does it yearn for freedom from samsara, from freedom from the endless rounds of birth and death and life? And so the teaching of reincarnation is really for souls that are somewhat more highly developed and who have had some intuitive inkling as we look around. I mean, think of modern life. We can travel anywhere. We see all sorts of lifestyles and attitudes and cultures, and we begin to see ourselves in other people, and we begin to say, wow, what do I want to go through that again? I remember first coming on the path of yoga and learning about reincarnation, and my exit strategy went something like this. I said, I don't want to come back because I don't want to have to be a teenager again. But everybody has their own story in that respect. We've died 1,000,000 times. We know what that is. It's just the death of the body. Life goes on. And when you look at science today, as they explore what's behind matter, they find no matter at all. Doesn't matter. It's all energy. String theory. There's nothing there. There's nothing there. In fact, the observer is part of the experiment we learn in science. Science is moving rapidly towards a non-mechanistic universe. In fact, over 90% of the universe is invisible as dark energy and dark matter. The point of singularity, the black hole or the Big Bang out of which we all came, what is that point of singularity but the transcendent consciousness of spirit? And so reincarnation is the promise of the scriptures that our destiny, that we will find the transcendent eternal soul if we keep on the path of awakening. So let's talk a little bit about the law of karma, its corollary, its necessary corollary, one that's a little bit on the strict side, but there is an escape clause to that.
Actually, I'm going to finish talking about reincarnation because we want to share the reading. What we like to do at Ananda is have a quotation from the Bible and a quotation from the Bhagavad Gita and show the underlying similarity between those two teachings. And I think that's one of the reasons we were drawn, and Dr. Richard was drawn to invite us, is because we like to look at the similarities and not the differences between spiritual traditions. And so the Bible quote Hriman already gave, which is, "Him that overcometh will I make a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go no more out." Pretty clear what he's saying there. He that overcometh meaning overcometh the ego, transcends in spirit to God. Samadhi, as we like to call it in the teachings of the East, shall go out no more, will not need to keep reincarnating to learn the lessons. And the corollary reading from the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna says, silences Arjuna's reasonable doubts on the subject, not by reasoned argument, but by the frank statement contained in the 4th chapter of that scripture. Arjuna, you and I have passed through many births. I know all of them, though you, O chastiser of foes, recall them not. In other words, when we experience that freedom in spirit, that cosmic consciousness, we remember everything. And we can remember everything because we've transcended it. But when we haven't, as Riemann alluded to, when we have not yet transcended, not yet transcended the ego, then it's very painful to look at, or it can be painful. It doesn't have to be painful. There are joyful moments in our past lives, to be sure. But the way the teachings of the East describe it, we have been everything in prior lives. We've been musicians and speakers and audiovisual people and accountants and you name it. We have done it all. We've been pirates and we've been criminals. We have, through millions of incarnations, done it all. And so some of that would be very, very difficult to know, and it would hold us back in this life. In the new life, essentially, we have what feels like a clean slate. We don't actually have a clean slate. Anyone who has children knows, or more than one child, knows they really come in with their own baggage, don't they? They already have it. So the slate isn't clean in that sense, but they're not conscious of it. And so we still have a chance to change and to become more and more perfect. There is the, often we like to tell people that Mozart, for instance, at the age of 5 was composing, well, symphonies that are seemingly eternal in their beauty. Where did he get that at that very, very young age? Luther Burbank, who is the one that Yogananda dedicated his book, Autobiography of a Yogi, to, he and Henry Ford were friends, and they both believed in, accepted the doctrine of reincarnation. And he put it this way: just because we don't remember what it was like to be in our mother's womb doesn't mean it didn't happen. In other words, because we don't remember these past lives doesn't mean they didn't exist. And finally, I just want to point out, I like to put things in very simple terms. We raised 2 children. We had 2 children. And back in the day when they were under 2 and in a high chair, they didn't have seat belts in high chairs yet. So invariably, our little son, the first one, would stand up in the high chair, and I'd say, no, 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 sit down. You're going to fall and you're going to hurt yourself. And of course, he'd sit down when I was looking, but the minute I turned my head, he'd stand up. And then I thought, well, perhaps he'll learn the lesson the hard way, which is in fact what happened. I turned my head at one point. He fell down to the ground. He just cried and cried and cried from the pain of falling. And then I, of course, comforted him. And then I put him back in the high chair. And doggone it, when I turned my head, if he didn't do it again and again and again. If I had to count it, I'm going to say hundreds of times. He'd go through the same scenario, experience the pain from the action, and yet still do it again and again. And I understood that is what we do. That is what we all do in our lives. We sort of like not, getting in trouble and just testing the waters for ourselves and testing it again and again and again, thinking that we can change it before we finally have to accept and move on and learn the lessons. And that is what, in a very simplistic way, reincarnation, that's why it makes sense to me, because we experience this in our own lives. And so I want to go on now to that subject of karma, because the two, as Hriman said, really go hand in hand. And the world starts to make sense when you put these two concepts together. Of course, karma, the word in the East, means action. And in the West, in the Bible, it correlates with the concept of sowing and reaping. It's not a new concept, it's the same concept. So in the Epistle of St. Paul to the Galatians, he contains this oft-quoted statement, "Be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap." And then the correlating quote in the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna says, "He who beholds inaction in action and action in inaction is wise among men. He is one with the Spirit. He has attained the true goal of action, meaning perfect freedom." And so this law of karma, we make mistakes, which generate bad karma. We have good hearts, which generates good karma. But whether good karma or bad karma, it's still karma until we can do it, recognize that God is the doer, and attune ourselves to God, to Spirit. There was a disciple of Yogananda's who lived in his monastery. And at a certain point, this man left, and he left because he had a really hard time with one of the other men in the monastery, and he couldn't tolerate it anymore. And then he came back one day to talk to his friend, Swami Kriyananda, and he said, "You know, that man, the reason I left," his name was Jerry, by the way, he said, "where I'm working now, there are 6 Jerrys." In other words, we can't run away from our tests. Wherever we go, we'll face them. Haven't we seen this to people we know who get divorced, and then they turn around and they remarry exactly the same kind of person. And you can see it. For some reason, that test and that attraction continues. I want to tell you a little story about a great yogi. He was actually Yogananda's guru's guru, Lahiri Mahashai. I'm just going to call him a yogi for this purpose. And he liked to go for a dip in the Ganges every day. It's considered a holy river, and it's also an opportunity for bathing and blessing at the same time. And this particular morning, he went with a disciple of his. They were walking along, and he said to the disciple, "Please tear off a piece of your cloth," the loincloth that he had. And the disciple was perplexed, and he started to ask why. And in that moment, a brick fell down from a patio up above as they were passing, and it hit the yogi's foot, and it started bleeding, and the yogi quickly tore off a piece of his own cloth, and he bandaged it so it wouldn't bleed so profusely. And the disciples said, "But sir, if you knew that was going to happen, why didn't you avoid it?" And the yogi answered and said, "It was happening as a result of my karma, and if I had tried to avoid it, I would have to pay that karmic price with interest." He said, "If I knew I had to experience it anyway before I could be free, why not do it more quickly and get it behind me so I can move forward in freedom?" And in freedom now, we'd like to have a chant and a brief meditation. The chant is called "You Fill My Heart with Music."
You fill my heart with music. I dance through life with thee. I sing your song and sorrows gone. In joy I live ever free. You fill my heart with music. I dance through life with thee. I sing your song and sorrows gone. In joy I live ever free. You fill my heart with music. I dance through life with thee. I sing your song and sorrows gone. In joy I live ever free. You fill my heart with music. I dance through life with thee. I sing your song and sorrows gone. In joy I live ever free. I sing your song and sorrows gone. In joy I live ever free. I sing your song and sorrows gone. In joy I live ever free.
Let's have just a few moments of silence together. Open the door of your heart as you sit upright with the eyes softly closed. Go deep into the heart through layers of past lives, into the river of life within. Be free. My heart is filled with music. Feel that sense. No body, no past, only now, only thee. I am free. Rest now. St. Augustine said, oh, Lord, our hearts are restless until they rest in Thee. Rest now in Thee. And now mentally offer this freedom to those in your life, to the circumstances of your life. Walk through life free. Do your duty as you must, with freedom and joy, but be free. So let's consider a few other things. What's the escape clause? How do we get out of this mess we've made, so to speak? Countless past lives, countless desires. Yogananda was once asked by Swami Kriyananda, do all my desires have to be worked out? A desire for an ice cream cone? And Yogananda said, oh yes, even small desires. My mother tells the story that when I was in a stroller, or whatever those things are called, that were called back then, that I saw a little kid go by with an ice cream cone, and I screamed my head off. So I guess I have to work that one out too. So is there an escape? Do you remember the story in the Bible? Jesus was dining at the house of a wealthy man and so on, and then this woman came in and she washed his feet with her tears. And everyone there was shocked because she was a sinner, so-called. Jesus' response to their unspoken thoughts and criticism was simply, though she has sinned much, her sins are forgiven because she has loved much. To the extent to which we can discover the natural love of the heart, the extent to which we aspire towards freedom, that we aspire to the transcendent, egoless state of our soul, which is eternal, changeless, unborn, and eternal. When we turn inward and upward towards that state, then our progress in transcendence of our karma is rapidly accelerated. The law of love is greater than the law of karma, that is, because love is our very nature. It is the nature of God and the nature of the soul. What happens in a process way, rather than just stating maxims or a platitude in this way, is that to the extent that we attune our consciousness to the transcendent, present, ever joyful consciousness of our own true self, to that extent we actually create a magnetism, an aura of protection. Sharda Devi, the wife of the great Ramakrishna Paramahansa in the 19th century in India, once said that if it's your karma to lose an arm, that a devotee might only get a cut. So there is a power of protection living in the presence of God, which is to say in the vibration of inner freedom, the vibration of acceptance, surrender to the will of God. There is protection in that. It's not that your karma, what you did in the past, can't be changed, but its impact on you decreases to the extent there's no ego left. What comes of its own, Yogananda would tell his disciples, let it come, let it be. Things that you can't change in that way. To remain even-minded and cheerful under all circumstances isn't easy. Maybe not the cheerful part, and sometimes we say calm acceptance. Then that is the doorway to freedom. We can't, as I say, change the karma, but we change that which links us to the karma, which is the ego itself. Let's have now the reading from the Bhagavad Gita.
Which one did you just read? Okay. Well, Sri Krishna says in the Gita, he urges the devotee not to be satisfied with spiritual precepts alone, but to go beyond them to the direct inner experience of truth. And so he says, nay, but once more take my last word, my utmost meaning have. Precious thou art to me. Right well, beloved, listen, I tell thee for thy comfort this, give me thy heart, adore me, serve me, cling in faith and love and reverence to me. So shalt thou come to me. I promise true, for thou art sweet to me. And let go those rites and writ duties, fly to me alone. Make me thy single refuge. I will free thy soul from all its sins. Be of good cheer. And so often people, when they think about the law of karma, they think about, well, I've got to write this and balance that and do this and do that, and this has happened to me because I have bad karma, or whatever the case might be. But Krishna is saying in this, cling to me. Focus your attention, focus your heart on God, and all these things shall be righted in due time. There's a beautiful story in, there were these 3 hermits living on an island, and they were very dedicated and devoted, and they were not schooled in religion, but from their hearts they had a very simple prayer. Lord, thou art 3, we are 3, have mercy upon us. That was their prayer. Well, the bishop who lived on the mainland heard about these hermits and their prayer, and he felt a little sad because they didn't know. They obviously were sincere, but they didn't know the right prayers to offer. And so he was taken in a little boat to the island, and he found the 3 hermits. And they just fell on their knees. They were so thrilled to see the bishop. And he said, I've come to teach you the right prayers to offer. And so he took a little time and he taught them a few of the prayers in that tradition. And when they thought they had it, he went back on his boat and started to head to the mainland again. And at a certain point, he looked behind him on the boat and he saw this big ball of light sort of coming from a distance and getting closer and closer to the boat. And then when it got very close, he realized the 3 hermits were running on top of the water to catch up with him. And they said, Sir, please stop. We forgot some of the words in the prayer that you just taught us. And the bishop said, well, I think your prayer seems to be working very well for you. He said, that's okay, just keep doing that one. And so it is that when we cling to God and we offer our love to God from the natural love of the heart, give me thy heart, that is all that God wants of us. So, Hriman? We're doing okay.
naturally we have much more to say and offer than the clock permits. So let me read this statement. In chapter 3 of the Gospel of John, Jesus said, "The wind blows where it wills, but you hear the sound of it, but you do not know where it comes from or where it is going. So is everyone who is born of the Spirit." If you know your Bible, you know Jesus spoke these words to Nicodemus, who secretly was interested in Jesus' teaching and more open than his fellow scribes and Pharisees were. And yet, in the Shankya philosophy scriptures of India, there's an interesting statement, very often, all too often, misquoted. And it goes, Ishvara Ashida, which means God cannot be proved. Some people take that to mean that the Shankya teachings are atheistical, but that couldn't be further from the case. It's rather that the proof of the soul, the proof of God, is an intuitive one. It is one based on faith, as St. Paul put it, the evidence of things unseen. And so it is the life of a true seeker, the life of a devotee, is a life of faith. And faith means that you don't know all the answers. Like those three hermits. By the way, that story was from Tolstoy, Leo Tolstoy. And like those hermits, they didn't know the right prayers, but they had the faith that brought to them the divine power and spirit. And so it is with each of us. We're Westerners, we use our left brain, we're into science. Science is our God, truthfully, as a culture, maybe not you and I, but in the culture generally. And so that's how we think, and we want to know how things work. And that's perfectly fine, of course, but intuition, I remember my teacher, Swami Kriyananda, saying that patience is the fastest route to God. And I was younger at that time, and I thought, patience? Fast route to anything? How could that possibly be? Patient, calmness, or as Lahiri Mahashai, one of the sages in the autobiography, said, Banat Banat Banjai, every day, doing, soon done. And intuition is that knowingness that comes out of the calmness of our soul. And it's not so much that being a devotee, living by faith, means, as worldly people tend to imagine, that a saint is only spontaneous, a little bit goofy, perhaps incompetent. That's really not true. If you study the lives of saintly people, you find that they're filled with power and resolution and intelligence. But nonetheless, to live intuitively means to be guided from that quiet, calm space which lives within us at the center of our emotions, at the center of our restless thoughts. And that, of course, is exactly why meditation develops intuition. Yogananda put it this way: intuition is the soul's power to know God, but then God is everything. So in my book, intuition is the power to remember where I put my car keys. I'm just joking. That's actually subconscious memory, not intuition. But the point is, I think whether it's Einstein or a great artist or a composer, you know, the great composers and others, and Einstein saw the solution that became the theory of relativity in an image that came to him in one moment. It took him a long time to work out the math, the thought experiment, as he put it. But truth is that knowingness. And the more we can learn to be still and know, as it says in the Psalms, then to that extent we have access to not just information, which can be very useful for sure, but also inspiration, which can be life-changing. So, Padma?
Well, we have run out of time, but the corollary Bhagavad Gita reading is, by me the whole vast universe of things is spread abroad by me, the unmanifest, in me all existence contained, not I in them. And this is a very interesting reading in the Gita, because he's saying God is eternal, God is infinity, God is within us, but that's not the only definition of God, because God is infinity. And so we tend to think as limited human material bodies and personalities, that this is what we are, and therefore if God is within me, then God is in here. But we fail to see the divine reflected everywhere. It's like the wave on the ocean saying, I am the ocean, but the wave is but the bulge of the ocean in that particular point. It is part of the ocean, but it's not all of the ocean. And so that is what this particular reading was. Now, I just have 2 minutes left, and so I'm just going to read the next Bible Gita comparison. In the Bible, St. John says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, speaking of Christ. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. Now this, of course, is a very deep subject that we don't have time to go in 2 minutes. The corollary Bhagavad Gita reading is, O son of Arjuna, in whatever way people accept me, in that same way do I appear to them. For all men in some way pursue the path to me. And so it is that, it's one of the reasons we love this program that they're offering to do here at Unity, that we're a part of, which is that innate understanding that there are probably as many paths to God as there are individuals. And they're all true paths because they're true to that individual. I can't tell the whole story, but maybe I can't even tell any of the story. But there was a great saint in India named Namdev, and he had many disciples. And there was also a potter in the same village who was wonderful spiritually, and he had many disciples. One day there was a festival, and the potter went around to everyone present and rapped on them the way a potter does to see if the pot has any cracks in it. And he got to Namdev, and he did that, and Namdev was insulted and got angry with them. And the potter said, there must be a crack in this pot. And Namdev was so insulted and hurt in front of everyone, so he went to pray to Krishna, who was the Lord he prayed to. And he said, how could you do this? You know that I love you. And the Lord responded and said, but what could I do? There is a crack in that pot. So one thing led to another. He led him to his guru in another village, who turned out to be a real crazy man, a lunatic. And he asked people where to find him, and they said, oh, he always hangs out at the temple. He goes there to find him, and he sees this crazy man with his foot on a holy symbol. And Namdev was outraged. He said, you can't do that. And the man said, well, I'm very old. I don't move very well. Can you move my foot for me? And so Namdev moved his foot, and right where he placed his foot down, another spiritual symbol appeared. And then he moved his foot again, and another spiritual symbol appeared. And then he understood the lesson that God was teaching him, that God is everywhere. And so let's now have this beautiful song, Krishna's Flute, by Swami Kriyananda.
Krishna represents God, and the flute represents the call that our soul feels to come home to God. I've heard your flute high on a cloud, your call I can't resist. Oh, let me come and play with you. We'll scatter music with the dew and sound the morning mist.
I've heard you piping on a hill, all else I've set aside. Oh, let us dance the mountain peaks. We'll skip with breezes on the creeks and soar the valleys wide.
Your flute has called me to the fields. Now I've no place to live. Don't send me back, rejected friend. Whatever I call mine must end. All that I am, I give.
I hear your flute in every tree, in every flower and stream, and sweetest melody of all, a song that heaven's joy recalls. Here in my heart you seem.
Thank you, and Dr. Richard and the staff here and all of you present online for participating, and it's been our privilege and joy to be here. Thank you. Thank you, Dambara, Peony.